c'est à moi que tu parles, là. Oh, c'est à moi que tu parles. Mec, c'est à moi qui parle, son cul. C'est à moi qui parle, putain. C'est à moi que tu parles comme ça, mec.
Tu vois, le mec qui arrive comme ça, il fait « Je crois que je fais n'importe quoi pour de l'argent. Je crois que je tuerai même des gens. » Son copain l'aura comme ça, il fait « Je crois que je te tuerai même toi pour de l'oseille. » L'autre carrément il péfrit, il lui fait, il lui dit, tu sais quoi? Il fait mais non, je rigole, toi t'es mon ami, je te tue pas pour de l'argent, je te tue gratuit. C'est gratuit. C'est pas mortel comme ça, ça. Le mec il lui dit, toi je te tue gratuitement. Vin, c'est pas mortel comme ça.
The visual motif of attending the cinema within French film, a form of mise en abîme, evolves into a critique not only of the Americanization of French cinema, but cinema's ability to influence the idea of masculinity.
The influence of the American archetype within French cinema has existed since 1946 Bloom-Burns Agreement, which introduced a market of American cinema into French culture as a way to cancel France's war debt and rebuild a post-war France.
Exhibited throughout Matteo Kazowitz's La Haine, 1995, the use of intertextuality with American crime films promotes an unfavorable comparison between the new French man and the toxic male American archetype that inspires the characters.
Haine investigates the myth of masculinity through the development of Vince. The character masquerades as the anti-hero of an American crime film, repeating lines and reenacting scenes from the characters that inspire him. This warped view of his own masculine identity contradicts how he is perceived by the community, and his influence from these American characters becomes the visual reinforcement of how he wishes to be perceived by his peers.
Vince's connection to this cinematic archetype highlights the lack of security he feels towards his own masculinity, choosing to hide behind an invented facade rather than presenting himself honestly.
It's when Vince chooses to show his friends the policeman's gun that he found from the previous night's riot that he can finally conceptualize himself gaining respect from the bon nous. The gun becomes a motif and therefore an extension of his own masculinity.
However, as an audience, we first see a glimpse into Vince's true character when his friends have been arrested. Choosing to run away from the conflict, he finds refuge inside a cinema.
The films Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Sudden Impact are playing when Vince is hiding out in the cinema.
This contextualizes how Vince is playing a character separate from his own reality, and the parallels to American films render how Vince has encapsulated himself into a cinematic narrative of his making, where he is hunting out revenge, but simultaneously being hunted.
Vince is using cinema as a form of escapism from his own troubling reality. Not only does it enforce his identity of masculinity, but it enforces his need for action. Although with regards to this statement, Vince encapsulates his identity with the narratives of pre-existing American gangster hero archetypes, as a form of reassuring his own masculinity back to himself.
The character of Vince exists separately to his influences. Throughout the narrative of the film, he chooses to force his perception of himself to change. This allows him to further align his identity with the fictional archetypes of American cinema. The question then arises, how does his identity exist without the obvious cinematic influence?
The repeated verbalization of reasoning for murder becomes Vince's way of coping with his environment and the fate of his friend. He promotes himself as someone who can kill another for revenge. This act exists as a deflection from the social issues at hand. His friend is in the hospital and might not survive, and he was hospitalized due to police brutality that exists in the banlieue.
The gun offers Vince protection, but also a symbol to promote his ability to seek revenge, revealing the grim reality of the banlieue culture. The way Vince positions himself within the banlieue culture enables him to initially avoid the consequences of his environment. With the gun, Vince can kill. He is seen as dangerous, a threat.
But when faced with the actuality of his environment, does Vince's invented identity erode away? At this moment, the audience sees Vince's true character, a boy robbed of his childhood due to the environment of crime, police brutality, and death. The banlieue.
Vince can't outlive his narrative. After choosing to spare the skinhead, Vince is free from the myth of masculinity he forced himself into. But like the characters he modeled himself after, he is killed.
The friction between Vince's perceived reality that shadows the American archetype and the culture of the banlieue cannot coexist.
The influence of the American archetype that is presented throughout Haine demonstrates the consequences of the type of masculinity prevalent in American films. Vince has to face the consequences of the reality of his own fabrication and achieve his false narrative by dying, much like the characters that inspired him.
Haine frames the idea of masculinity as never truly attainable. Therefore, a myth that has been intertwined with the identity of American archetypes, competing with the banlieue culture.
Sans tes copains, tu fais que ta mère. Qu'est-ce que tu fais là? Tu flanques moi, hein? Qu'est-ce que tu fais là? Regardez là. Regarde, regarde.